Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm here with Curt and Jerry again. We got a great episode for you today. As always, we're going to start out with our bright, shiny objects, and then we're going to move in to starting to look at trauma's impact on brain development. If you haven't heard some of this research, we're going to go over the adverse childhood experience study and really the biological impact of trauma on the brain. And again, how that happens oftentimes in early childhood and can really affect how the brain develops over time. I always like to put the preference in is if we can get people the help and resources they need, no trauma is a life sentence. And I believe by the end of our podcast today, you'll understand why it's so important to get, as we talk about right now, children, but really anybody who's been through a traumatic experience, the right kind of support and resources to really heal and grow from the experience. So we got a great show for you today. Like we always do, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week as three guys who obsess and are continuing our own learning around this and thinking around this. We just like to start out with what we're thinking about this week. And I'm going to start us out like normal with this week. And I got two small things, but they're sort of related both to the podcast. One is a thank you out there to my friend, Molly Hibbert, who is, if you've been listening from episode 1, hopefully you've seen us working hard to become more and more of a polished podcast. And she wrote some original music for us. I wanted to give Jerry her French horn and see what he would come up with. I could play. I have a Native American flute. I don't know, Curt, you could probably actually play an instrument maybe. But I asked her to give us some music, and I thought she did a really good job. So just a little bit about Molly. She's a certified music therapist, and she's just created a company called 6 Beat. And her and her husband, Travis, are great friends of mine, and they have this little house out in Bryan, Colorado, where they are farmers. They have chickens and gooses and ducks and all kinds of living things running around their land. So they call their little homestead out there the 6 Beat Farm, and they spell beat B-E-E-T. So Molly has, Jerry, I know, and Curt maybe as well, worked at Mount St. Vincent Home here in Denver as a music therapist, and they've done some really great trauma-informed work. And she's just started her own private practice in Northwest Denver area. So you can see her work. She's great with kids and has some really innovative things going on. And again, if you want to check out more on her, it's the number 6 and then BEET.com. So just a shout out to Molly. Thanks a lot. And my other short, small one is I've gotten a lot of really cool feedback on the podcast over the last week or so. So I want to thank, I had a great dinner down in Colorado Springs with Curt and Greg Morris. Curt Morris is a huge fan of ours, so I want to give him a shout out as well. He says he listens to the podcast every day as he's driving into work and sometimes listens to it on a repeat. So they do some great work with folks experiencing homelessness down in Colorado Springs. And also actually yesterday got a Victoria from the United Kingdom reached out. So we have now an international audience for our little podcast here. So it was exciting to get something from the continent across the pond. And just for all of you, so you know, we are 3 mental health professionals trying to do a podcast for the first time. So we really appreciate any of your feedback. And if you go to traumainformedlens.org, you can leave comments in the show notes section, or there's a contact page that you'll see up at the top, and we read and share each and every one of those. So if you want to reach out to us, give us any feedback, help us with our learning curve, we always appreciate it. So, and if you just want to reach out and say, hey, like the show, let us know, because we love to hear from people that are listening. So those are my bright, shiny objects of the week. Jerry, what do you got?
So this week, I read an interesting article, and it was a research project. And really, you know, we've talked about on the show how our experience can actually change our genes and change our brain. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But this article talked about how mindfulness is that when we're paying attention to the present moment, we actually can increase positive experiences for ourselves, which actually increases dopamine and other positive chemicals in our brain that have, and when we are non-judgmental, it reduces negative experiences. So the combination of those is that we have the ability to change our own physiology, which changes our perception of the world, and then changes how we relate, and then how we relate actually changes the experiences we get. So a lot of what we talk about in trauma has so much to do with disempowerment and feeling in some ways reactive to the environment. And some of the, you know, the research really is beginning to talk about how much really people have lots of control over the experiences that they have internally, but also what they can actually bring into their lives. So made me feel much more empowered this week.
Awesome. And mindfulness, I was writing some stuff on it this week as well. And that non-judgmental piece I find fascinating, because it's part of, you know, those, whether you're reading Kabat-Zinn or Siegel, it's one of those 5 universal aspects of mindfulness. But I'm also really thinking a lot about it as, how do we teach people to be non-judgmental, and how do we help them kind of interrupt negative self-talk patterns and be kind to themselves? And I've kind of thought a little bit too about how we combine that with some of the fixed and growth mindset that Carol Dweck does, because so many people with trauma have that fixed judgmental mindset, and you know, being kind to yourself, but also seeing struggles as opportunities as well. I think there's really some gold there that I've been interested in exploring in a big way as well. So really cool stuff.
It really is. And, you know, it's a lot easier when you have somebody show up in your life that makes you feel special.
Yeah.
And you have that internal experience that you can kind of generate off of.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
I think, you know, we'll talk a little bit that in the brain development today.
Absolutely. And speaking of somebody that makes us all feel special, Curt, what's your bright, shiny object for the week?
Well, I love the concept you brought up, Jerry. I love the kind of the hand-in-glove relationship between what we do and how the environment gives us feedback about what we do, and how those two things can impact each other. And once you get that ball rolling, it can go in the right direction really, really quickly. And just getting that started, I think, is a real fun thing for me to be able to do professionally, to be able to help people do that. And I found when I do it myself, it works great, and I feel great about it. I have a literal bright, shiny object for today, and it had to do with my ride to work this morning, and how challenges at times create opportunities for us. So my goal today was to get to my office early enough to write a little bit and think a little bit before we talked about all of these complex things today. So I was in a rush to get to work, and I have to drive all the way through Denver to get to my office. So I'm going to experience traffic. There's no way around it. And I did, predictably, in the right spot where I thought it would happen, right? It's every morning this happens. And it made me slow down, and it made me pause. And I looked up, and there was the most beautiful sunset that I had seen, and I didn't even see it until the traffic made me do it. And it gave me that moment to sit down and look at the orange sky. And at the same time, here was this, I was listening to Amazon Music, I think, on the way, and I picked the PlayStation of Mumford and Sons. So, this real instrumental music with a lot of rhythm in it. And so I'm listening to this great music and looking up at the sunrise and going, wow, if I hadn't had this obstacle get in my way, I wouldn't have done that. And I would have just kept going towards my goal and not thought another thing about it. And so that was my literal bright, shiny object, was the sun in the sky this morning, coming to work. And it made me really think a lot about, and maybe pause and think about the experience that I was having and the multiple components of that experience, which got me thinking about our topic today, which is how the brain develops and how we process information. So this experience for me was multiple components, or multiple parts of the experience that I had. Sensory experience. So part of it was the sound. Right? So I had the sound, and that was coming into my body through my ears and getting integrated in my brainstem, and then creating reactions in my limbic system. So I had some emotional reaction to that. And then I had my vision providing me information that was getting to my spinal cord, going to my brainstem, getting to my limbic system, and creating an experience for me. And then I also started to notice, there's a great mindfulness exercise, I started to notice that there was a vibration component to that, right? Because I had the music up really loud. And so the bass in the music and the rhythm of the music was creating vibrations in my seat in my car. So I could feel all of that going from my feet all the way to my legs and into my torso. And all of those sensory experiences were all entering my body through sensory receptors, getting organized and integrated in terms of chemical and electrical signals that goes to my brainstem, and then it goes to my limbic system. And then I can start to think about it when it gets to my cortex, and I can start to notice all of the components of this experience. And I love moments like that. And it got me thinking about these concepts of today, of how we process information, how early experience can change how that happens, and how when we get optimal development, we really have a lot of ability to adjust to our environment in really exciting ways, as you were talking about, Jerry, that we are equipped with all of these mechanisms that human beings, as such a successful species on our planet, can adapt to an environment in so many different ways. We keep learning new ways that we have mechanisms that prepare us to do that, and how exciting that is. So I thought about that on my way to work, and that was my bright, shiny object to our topic of today. And thinking about these concepts of brain development and how that happens, I think it's hard to introduce those topics without going all the way back to one of all of our formative experiences, is the original ACEs study, and how that changed the way that our field thought about early childhood experience and risk factors, and what were risk factors and their impact on a variety of health or well-being endpoints, whether it be mental health, whether it be behavioral health, whether it be physical health, and overall well-being. It really kind of helped expand the whole field's understanding of how we think about those things. So that was where I kind of thought we could start our discussion a little bit. And Matt, knowing how you've talked about that before, that was such a formative experience for you, I wonder if you could give us your experience about reading the ACEs study and thinking about the implications of that, and how was that for you?
Absolutely. And the ACE study, as I shared, I believe in episode 1, around 2003, Jerry sat me down and showed me this, and my life has never been the same since. Very few research studies have quite that impact on me professionally and personally. And so just to give you a little bit of a background on the ACE study, because I think the story of the study helps to show where we were and how far we've come around the issues of trauma and neurobiology as well. And so the ACE study came out of a Kaiser Permanente project on obesity in San Diego, California, back in the mid-90s. And if I can rewind to the mindset of the mid-90s, very few of us, and I was in undergrad then, and in grad school I didn't hear this either, I was never told that past suffering caused current problems. That was something that was never taught to me. It seems ridiculous to even say those words out loud nowadays, but that was the reality there. And so they were doing these obesity studies in San Diego, California, and they were actually having really great success with the women in the study. And at some point, what the medical professionals who were doing this study started to find out is that at a certain point when these women lost weight, a lot of them would drop out of the study. And for any of us in the helping professions, the last thing you really want to do is lose your positive outcomes, because that's how you usually get funded to continue your services. So because they were Kaiser patients, and if you're not familiar with Kaiser, it's a large health insurance company out here in the West. And so because they were patients of Kaiser, they had all their contact information. So they did interviews with these women, and what they found out over and over, what they heard, and you got to think about, these are medical professionals. These aren't psychologists or mental health therapists. What they heard was, when I lost a certain amount of weight, men started to pay attention to me again, and it brought back memories of my past sexual abuse. And I, if you kind of read the history, it kind of seems like there may have been this holy bleep moment, so to speak. But they sat with it, and over time, what they did in San Diego is they developed the adverse childhood experience study. And this assesses for things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, emotional and physical neglect, household dysfunction, such as living with a parent that has an addiction or a mental health issue, parent that's incarcerated, if parents are divorced, those sort of issues. So they did an assessment across their 17,000 person patient population. And again, ACEs has been done in a lot of different ways, but just a huge data set that they had. And so because it was they had all the health records as well, they started to compare the number of adverse childhood experiences with, health issues. And then they went in further with social issues and disabilities as well. But what started to become very clear is the more ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, you had, the higher your rates for certain diseases, social problems, and disabilities. So we started to get this correlation between adverse childhood experiences and what they call the adaptation of health risk behaviors, such as smoking, such as higher rates of alcoholism, addiction. We can see social economic issues. They also have seen that, again, as your ACEs go up, you die earlier. I saw something that if you have that complex trauma we talked about, so multiple ACEs, that life expectancy is about 60 years compared to 80 years for someone with no adverse childhood experience. So you talk about a public health issue. There's, what other psychological things that's not a virus or a cancer in your body can take away 20 years of your life expectancy. And so they saw this real correlation between these two. The other thing that happened in the mid-90s is functional MRI started to come online as well. So as I like to say, it was basically the first time we could look at the brain working without sort of cutting it out of your skull and putting it on the table, which was not good for the person being studied. And so all of a sudden we had this, we could see the physical brain of people, the brain operating with people with these adverse childhood experiences. And I think this was my big piece of this, is as that research expanded, what we saw coming out of that is people with, and again, I always like to say that they haven't had a chance to heal from those adverse childhood experiences. It's not a life sentence, but that have had those adverse childhood experiences actually had a different brain operation and sometimes structured somewhat differently than people without adverse childhood experiences. And that, to me, started to really explain a lot of the behaviors that I saw, a lot of the struggles that my kids had. And as I saw a lot of their families were those kids that grew up and then had kids of their own, all of a sudden I started to see this brain in those kids that I was working with, and it started again to explain a lot of those behaviors. So the other thing I just want to throw out before I throw it back to you, Curt and Jerry, is the other thing that the ACE study, I think, changed how we think about trauma. And just to throw it out there, the ACE study was basically, if you were in this study, most people had insurance through employment. So we're not talking about people experiencing homelessness. I think 72% had college degrees. So I like to put that out for this next statistic, that they found that 2/3 of that patient population had at least one adverse childhood experience. So not only did it show us how trauma affected mental, physical, medical health, emotional health, it also showed us that, and I like to use this analogy, if you go to a normal high school, you could really think about this, and this is not a perfect analogy, but if you think about people graduating from high school, you can pretty safely assume that about 2/3 of the kids coming to get that diploma have had a childhood trauma in their life, which just shows the prevalence of trauma in a whole different way than we knew before.
One of the things I kind of pulled out of what you had just described, I think from your own personal experience of hearing the study, Matt, is that one of the things that both the ACEs study did, I think, for our field, and also it accomplished that for you personally, was it started to generate you thinking about another reason why things might be the way that they are, and help us to look for more information in other areas that might help us to answer that question in a more complex and a more sophisticated way. And I think that was, for me, the same experience, right? That, I mean, I had learned in a lot of training, both informal and formal, of why things happen in a variety of different areas. And one of them is, why am I seeing these symptoms from this person who I'm experiencing in my professional life, or sometimes in your own personal life? And my experience of getting this information helped me to start thinking about other whys, and what other mechanisms do I not know about that might be leading to this. And Jerry, this is where I love the words that you've been able to give to me over the years, is an understanding of some of the mechanisms that this might happen in the brain of a developing child, and what some of those things might happen. And for me, it generates the questions of, one, how does our brain get organized, and how does it process information? And how does early childhood experience either enhance that or take away from it? And how does development happen to organize it that way?
Right. So, you've covered lots of areas today, right? So we had this incredible study that was beginning to help us change the way that we understand, right? Because we were under the kind of the paradigm that the brain, the mind and the brain were separate from the body. Mm-hmm. So now we're having experiences that are saying that our experiences are not only changing the way we think and feel, but they're also changing our physiology. But we didn't really understand the mechanisms at the time that was leading to those results. So when the original ACEs studies came out, it was really very common for people to say there must be something wrong with the data. No kind of experiences can have this kind of impact in so many areas, right? So it didn't make sense to people in fitting into their paradigm. So really it created a shift, and we needed to kind of look at this concept of underlying mechanisms. And it's not only looking at the issue of trauma, but if 2/3 of the people in the study are reporting exposures to adverse experiences, we know that many people have had exposures to adverse experiences and continue to do really well.
Yeah.
So how is it that some people, based on these exposures, end up in a trajectory where they have multiple kinds of problems in their lives, and other people are exposed and they end up having really positive lives and good relationships and good health? So I think the study began to help us say we can't just look at experiences, but we have to look at how the individual is interacting with those experiences, right? So one of the things that we know is, as a species, we're born very, very, very dependent. we come into the world with a brain that really is designed to seek out another human being to help regulate it, right? We're wired to connect. So that when we're born, the brainstem, the lowest part of our brain, the most primitive part of the brain that we share with reptiles, is somewhat organized, fully organized, and then the emotional centers of our brain are in the process of developing at birth. But we're still very much dependent on the responsiveness of our caregivers to help regulate our physiology. And it's in this interaction between what's going on genetically in our bodies and the responsiveness of the caregivers that's going to calibrate the lower parts of our brain, in which there's very important neurotransmitters that are being organized at that point. So things like dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin, that's going to regulate our reward centers, that's going to regulate our motivation, regulate our emotional regulation, our ability to manage it, and then our stress response systems. So early in our birth, the interactions with our caretaking environment, not just our mother, because we're designed as a species to be cared for by multiple caretakers, but really the caretaking environment, the relational milieu, if you would talk about it, is going to respond in a way that's either going to help organize those systems at the lower part of the brain, or in some ways organize them to be extremely responsive to what we might call a stressful environment. So the way that the environment responds is going to begin to adapt those lower systems to the type of environment that this child is going to have to live in. So when the lower parts of the brain get organized, the next part of the brain really is the part of the brain that is constantly looking out in the environment and saying, is it safe or not? Am I safe? Is there a threat out there? Is how active does that part of the brain have to be? Or how regulated can that part of the brain be, so that that is also going to tell us what we have to pay attention to, right? So if I'm constantly looking for threat cues in the environment, my attention has to be directed towards potential external kind of stresses, as opposed to being able to, in some ways, be feeling what we call, what you call in attachment theory, you call feeling safe, feeling soothed, feeling adequately stimulated. That part of the brain gets organized to be on high alert in some respects. So if my caregiver is there to help in some ways respond and soothe my biology, even though there may be stressful things in the environment going on, internally, I feel like I have the capacity to manage those. So that when we look at the ACEs studies, we really can't look at the individual who experienced something, but we have to understand what was the context in which they were experiencing those things. What was the relational milieu? What kind of resources did they have? What kind of housing did they have? What kind of food did they have? Right? All of those things are very important. How safe was their community? Right? What are the other things impinging on the caregiver in their ability to be adequately responsive to this child? So as the limbic system begins to get organized, somewhere around 18 months to 2 years, the parts of our brain that we can have episodic memory and we begin to organize our experiences in terms of some contextual experiences. That part of the brain comes online, and really from 2 to 7, you see this cortex come online where we begin to create narratives of our experiences, and we begin to have top-down regulation of our body that we talked about in mindfulness, that we kind of look at that. And so when you have adequate relational support and the stresses on the caretakers in those environments are not overwhelming. You could be exposed to some adversity, but still in some ways have some capacity to manage those things. But with the combination of being exposed when my caregivers are overwhelmed, either because of what's currently going on or their past history, their capacity to be empathetically attuned to my internal experience and respond to my needs becomes diminished. And therefore, those experiences during this incredibly sensitive period become really overwhelming. My biology begins to adapt to being in an environment where really I can't count on other people or the world to meet my needs. So I have to be in some ways in a very, and my brain and my nervous system get organized to live in that kind of world. So the ACEs studies began to help us look at how experiences can change that and look at some of the negative outcomes. But we also know that there are certain types of experiences we could provide for children early on that actually could inoculate them to some of the long-term impacts of that. And you hear it all the time that people have gone through horrendous early life experiences. But if they have had at least one other person in their life that saw them as being special, that they had some type of talent or they had an engaging personality that brought people into their lives, they were actually able to be extremely resilient and be able to thrive in an environment that we would look at today. So I think that the ACEs studies kind of helped us understand that adverse experiences create high levels of stress, which trigger really chemicals that could either help us in the short run but become toxic in the long run. The relational environment is either going to be a buffer to that, or it's not going to be a buffer. And if that goes on for a prolonged amount of time, the body adapts and you get complex trauma, right? You get trauma symptoms later on, or you get other types of extreme coping strategies like eating disorders and smoking or promiscuous sexual behavior, so that it does it. And then those types of ways of coping, when new experience comes on, now you approach new experiences with your extreme coping strategies, which creates more stress, which creates other types of adverse experiences. So it's not just what happens early in life, but how it sets a developmental pathway that if there's not an intervention, your new experiences are going to be seen and reacted to based on past experiences, as opposed to being open to new experience and learning. So you either become, in Daniel Siegel's language, very chaotic in how you respond to things and you get overwhelmed, or you become so rigid that no matter what happens, this is how I have to respond to that, which then creates a continuing experience of adversity in your life. So that's really some of the patterns that we begin to see, and some of the early interventions, but some of what we've been talking about, a trauma-informed lens of understanding this, allows us not to be organized by the person's past experience, but really trying to figure out is what type of experience does this individual need in order to have, in some ways, change their biology, change their psychology, and have a new relational experience that allows them to heal, grow, and recover.
So Jerry, as you were talking, I thought of a couple of directions that we could take the conversation from here. And one is, as we think about all of those complex mechanisms that you just described between our environmental interactions and our biology and our physiology, in understanding those, we can go down to trying to compartmentalize and understand each one of those things individually and then integrate them later, or we can keep going into what should we do in a relational environment then, and how do we think about when we recognize things happening, what do we do about them? So, I mean, to either one of you, and Matt, especially your thoughts about what's helpful, do you think, for folks and for us as we've gone through learning this? How do you think about, should we kind of think about compartmentalizing and think about what happens in the brainstem, what happens in the limbic system? How is that connected to what happens in the cortex? And what are our feedback loops and our feed-forward loops there? And or should we go into what should a relational environment look like? Some thoughts about that would, I think, be great.
Yeah, you know, how I like to approach this when I'm working with folks and helping them understand this is, to me, you know, really the ACE study helps us understand a lot of the behaviors that we've talked about from episode 1 on, about why kids may struggle to sit in a classroom. I mean, you think about taking them out of a dysregulated home environment where there may be chaos or even violence and addiction, and then setting them in a kindergarten classroom, how they really struggle, and how a lot of these behaviors, whether they're in kindergarten or whether they're, you know, even in high school or even trying to get employment later on, that a lot of times they haven't developed the biological aspects or components of their brain to really be successful in some of these environments that we create and expect them to be successful in. So, you know, how I like to think about it is, we look at this neurobiological impact of an overactive limbic system, which is that emotional fear-based part of our system that's more relied on. As Jerry mentioned, there's that incredibly rigid sort of approach to stress and reaction, or that chaotic approach, neither of which necessarily translates into success in a lot of other environments. So one of my real focuses on it is, how do we give kids that may not have had the ability to be raised in a stable, regulated environment, how do we recreate some of those experiences later on? I like to think, and one of the words I love how it sounds, I love what it is how do we create attunement with people? Whether we're working with somebody in their 50s or whether we're working with a 5-year-old, how do we create a healthy relationship? And I always look at this, it's funny, I'm a non-breeder. My wife and I have decided not to have children for many reasons. But one of the things that is in my peer group now is I've got kids of all ages running around my friend group. And, you know, I watch these, especially with young kids, that you know, what I learned about babies is they're either hungry or they poop themselves a lot. And, you know, no matter what, they're like, the world's going to end. But then mom or dad takes a deep breath, because if a baby gets dysregulated, you have to watch real close with healthy people, that the parent will get dysregulated. A healthy parent will kind of take a deep breath, get themselves back regulated, which impresses the heck out of me when you got a crying baby with poop in its diaper. But they're able to regulate themselves. And then they go over the baby, they make eye contact, they pick up the baby, and the baby realizes that it's going to be okay. And that, throughout childhood development, brings on more and more independence from the child. Like Jerry said, they learn that, hey, yeah, I pooped myself and I'm hungry, but mom's okay. And repeat that experience a few hundred times, and their brain starts to internalize that, hey, it's going to be okay. And so, you know, with kids that haven't had that attunement, which often end up later on in life with a lot of the struggles that the ACEs show, you know, it's really about, how do we create that relationship milieu, as again, Jerry's, I think, words are very critical, to help them feel safe, to help them feel connected to somebody else at some point in their life. And so that, to me, is, I like to use the biological understanding and the neurobiological impact to understand some of the challenges that people face, and then also to say, okay, what do we need to help this person have some of those developmental steps that they may have not have had due to struggles of their families and their parents as well.
So one of the concepts I pull out of what you said there is this concept of serve and return. which is when the child does something, the environment or a caregiver kind of returns serve on that, to use a sports metaphor, and how important that is. And I think one of the things that, Jerry, if you don't mind me asking you this question, when we have those reactions in the environment, when a child does something and we as caregivers and members of that child's environment return serve on that, what happens in the child's brain when that happens? And what happens at different levels of a child's brain that creates a positive environment?
So let's for a second imagine ourselves being in the womb, right? Everybody. And imagine that I don't feel hungry because I'm being fed through the umbilical cord. I don't feel cold. I don't have to manage light or heavy sounds. Really, I'm in this, floating in this fluid, really in this state of being, not of doing, of being, just being. And my needs are being met. And now I'm born into this world and I'm bombarded with sensory information, both from the external world and from the internal experience of hunger, of cold. Based on my response from my environment, the first thing I have to learn how to do is integrate sensory information. So that sensory information has to be able, I've got to be able to tolerate it, integrate it, and be able, so when the caregiver is responding adequately, wrapping me in a blanket, holding me close to them with touch so I could feel the heartbeat, is they're keeping my sensory systems, my stress response system, within a window of tolerance. So that when it's in this window of tolerance, internally that's getting converted to neuroactivity, which then is organizing how these connections in the brain, the synapses and the dendrites, are being organized, and regulating the brain in terms of really the amount of neurochemicals that are being transmitted, right? And so if you think about developmentally, the first thing we have to do is learn how to integrate sensory information. Then we have to move from some level of auto-regulation to co-regulation, which is the environment, to self-regulation. And what's happening is when there is a responsive, when my parents or caregivers are reading my signals, when I'm hungry, I cry, they read the signals, and then they make sense of those signals and they respond. My internal system goes from a stress response system more to a reward system. I get shots of opiates that I feel calm and relaxed, and I have oxytocin that I feel connected, so that within this interactional psychological communication, all of that is being converted to pattern neuronal activity, which is organizing what we call the self-organizing brain. And this is happening during sensitive developmental periods. So that if there's an absence of those things, then my stress response system becomes more strengthened and more hyperreactive. And if you think from the child's perspective, you know what, I send a signal, nobody answers, I've got to start developing alternative strategies to kind of manage those internal states. So when there's serve and return, not only am I organizing the child's brain, but what I'm creating is what, in some ways, an expectation, or in Bowlby's language, a working model of the world, that when I have an internal need, I can express it, and the world is going to listen and respond to it. So that I begin to develop expectations, so that when I have dependency needs, I could tell somebody. When I'm angry, I can express it, somebody's going to hear it. If I grow up in an environment where there's not responsive, then I go to school and I'm not going to ask for help when I need it, because my internal model is people don't respond. right? And so that's how those early experiences both become physiologically embedded, but then they become relationally embedded. And we have a tendency then to reenact what happened earlier rather than have opportunities for new relational experiences. So when Matt talks about how he tries to be relational, right, is what he's trying really to do is not be organized by this person's past experience, but be with them in a way that is more like that serve and return that you talked about.
Yeah. Jerry, can you, one of the things that the ACE study and others have told me, and I believe I was hearing you touch on it, but I think it's a common question that a lot of people that work with kids coming out of, the dysregulated home that we're talking about, it taught me, and I think you can put it in really good language just of where you left off, is the power of neglect. Because a lot of times we focus, abuse is sort of easy for us, I think, to see, hey, there's bruises, there's, an assault, it's terrible, but yet I see some of the research coming out that neglect can be just, if in some ways, I don't want to rank them, but just if not more harmful. And can you build upon kind of what you just said to talk about some of that, the neurobiological impacts of when you reach out and there's nobody there?
So think about it as a species, we're born with an expectation that there be somebody there.
Yep.
And that our brain is dependent on the stimulation from the environment to activate certain networks to begin to organize them.
Yep.
So we know that, right? For example, we know that if the studies done when there were kittens that their eyes were blinded and they didn't get to see light during a sensitive period, their neural tracts, so their eyes worked, but the brain networks weren't there in place to make sense of that information. So that abuse is a hyper excitation of the stress response system, but neglect is the absence of stimulation that is necessary and expected during a developmental sensitive period so that the neural growth and connections are not happening. And so really, when we look at these children that were raised in orphanages, right, they don't have whether you have a secure attachment or an insecure attachment, that's an organized strategy to how to relate in the world. People who are left alone don't have a strategy.
Yeah.
It's not built in. And so they have a different type of attachment disorder, right? They don't have an experience of how do I get my needs met from somebody else? Yeah. And so those neural tracks have not even been organized. So you see some of the work from Dr. Bruce Perry where you see the brain actually atrophies because it hasn't had the opportunity to be stimulated.
Yeah.
So when we look at abuse, we're talking about what networks have been strengthened and what have been neglected in some ways. But in neglect, we're talking about the atrophy of the brain because it hasn't had an adequate level of stimulation.
Absolutely. I've also, just to kind of add to that too, I've also seen some research recently that especially sort of the if I'm hungry and there's nobody there, and again, over an extended period of time, repeated behaviors, that can sort of, in many ways, create a life or death sort of reaction in the young child. Because like you said, a toddler is not going to, get out of the crib and go fix itself dinner. And so that I think incredible vulnerability that we have from an early age really sets, whether it's physical or an emotional neglect, a real powerful reaction that can have really long-term consequences.
Right. And there's a lot of research, I can't cite it, but the body does everything it can do to protect the brain.
Yeah.
So it's going to allocate resources to protect this brain, which not only is the brain beginning to atrophy. But because resources are going to protect the brain, you see issues about growth changes in children that are neglectful. You see, physical or, manifestations in terms of immune system vulnerability. So that neglect is a very, very powerful long-term impact on the developmental trajectory of children. And we actually, because we're, most of the research that came out of trauma originally in our culture came out of the war opportunities, we were much more geared towards those people who are hyper-reactive and aggressive than this issue of neglect and running down.
Absolutely. Curt, I want to throw it back to you, and I've been sort of dying to ask you this question, because one of the things that I really see as well is that when you talk about the serving of that positive reinforcement, sort of from that behavioralist perspective, and I think we would all agree that positive reinforcement is part of great parenting. I just kind of wonder, from your perspective, and let's say you're working with a kid in elementary school, but comes from a home where I always use the example, especially when we talk about the ACEs of addiction and maybe mental illness, of a kid that on a Monday does the dishes, mom came home, didn't stop at the bar to get high and drunk on the way home, kid does the dishes, praises the kid. Thank you so much. Great job. I really appreciate this. You really help out. And then, so that's on Monday, but on Tuesday, mom gets drunk. So I guess there would be serving going on Monday. The kid did something good. Mom gives that feedback, if I'm understanding you right. Tuesday, mom does stop home, gets drunk after work, comes home. Kid does the dishes the exact same way, but now mom berates the kid. Mom yells at the kid, maybe gets verbally abusive. And I'm wondering, from the behavioralist perspective, what the heck is, how do you look at that? Is it there's serving one day and then the next day there's not a logical continuation of that? And just kind of wonder if you see any of the long-term impact and how that can manifest later on in struggles with cause and effect and other things that I know you focus so heavily on.
I think one thing you'd get out of that situation is a confused kid.
Yeah.
That's what you get. So go back to I think one of the exciting things that I love about learning this whole process of learning and organizing and adding to the information is that when we have multiple lines of study within science that align with each other. And going back to Jerry's concepts of talking about serve and return and how a child learns early on in life that when I fuss, that occasions a caregiver's responsiveness to me. Mm-hmm. And so that is an important learning environment from just an environment, behavior, interactional perspective that aligns with what we know now happens in the brain. And one of the things that I think about from a behavioral perspective a lot is the theory of how behaviorism got started. And one of the things that one of the founders of radical behaviorism was B.F. Skinner. And one of the things that he said was, someday the physiologists of the future will be able to tell us all of the answers to these questions. But he didn't have the technology to answer those questions 50 years ago, or even longer when he said that. And so his focus was on a theory of science, or a methodology of science, that was focused in on what we could observe and what we can measure. Mm-hmm. Well, we now have very different technology, and what allows us to observe and measure things is very different now than it was then. What we're finding is that what happens inside the skin follows laws and as physical events, just like what happens outside the skin. And we keep getting better information about how we understand it, the better our technology gets for good observation and measurement, which is critical to science. Yeah. So I like for me, it's a real good match between those two things. And one of the things that we know about behavior from the study of behavioral principles is that when we serve, or when we emit some behavior that is essentially supposed to work, either it has worked in the past, or we're biologically prepared to emit that response in that environment. If it doesn't work, one of the first things that our bodies do is to escalate the signal so that it does generate a responsiveness from our environment. We go through this, what we call this in the behavioral world, the extinction burst. If I've gone through, you take the example of, we all have a history of putting money into a vending machine and getting candy or a soda out of it. Well, if you go to a vending machine and you put your dollar in now, or I don't know, is it $1.25 now? You put it in and nothing happens. You don't walk away. You push the button harder. And you may push it multiple times before you go, well, I guess this one doesn't work and I'm going to walk away. Right? So you escalate. Or you may
tilt the machine over, depending on if you're me or.
Right. and that's a part of what happens as extreme coping strategies get developed, either in an environment where a caregiver is not responsive, the child escalates the signal. And if that signal then occasions a caregiver response, it gets trapped by our own mechanisms for changing our behavior, which is the serve and return interaction. Yeah. And that starts a trajectory, is, you can go right into what Jerry was talking about, is you can start that ball rolling down a trajectory that you may not intend, without being a little more thoughtful about it and understanding that. Or you can start it going the other way, right? When children go through this internal state of becoming dysregulated, and they need to be regulated by a caregiver, that's an important, critical serve and return interaction. One of the, go back to the school example, which I know, Matt, you're super interested in schools. One of the things I hear the most in school environments is that when a child engages in behavior that is disruptive to the classroom, and it is characterized as attention seeking, right? That people will very, very quickly think about what they need to teach that child, which is a very well-intentioned statement. Yeah. And what often gets said is, I need to teach that child that they can't always get what they want. Mm-hmm. Which is an important point, I think, to reframe and go, is that really what you want to teach children? Yeah. That if they have needs that they can't get them met. And that, that was probably a question that Jerry asked me one day, right? And I was like, well, God, I'm a jerk. No, I don't want to teach any children that. What I really want to teach them is that when they can't get their needs met immediately, it'll be okay. Yeah. That they can handle it, and that there is a resource for them to do that, either internally or externally. And when you reframe the question that way, it changes the direction you take with intervention. Yeah. It's just asking a little bit of a different question about what do we want to teach children, and what do we want to teach other people about their interactions with the world, and what happens when you can't get your needs met right now. Can you handle it, and how do we arrange an environment to teach those things? So for me, that's a wonderful blend between what's a behavioral perspective and what's a trauma perspective, and they align very well for me in those areas, and being able to teach people those interactions. And going back to positive reinforcement, one of the things I love about the brain research is a great slide. We got to throw it up maybe on the website, which shows that when reinforcement or reward happens, it activates certain areas of our brain. Mm-hmm. And many of those things, it's the same area of the brain, whether or not it's sugar, whether or not it's sex, or whether or not it's alcohol, or whether or not it's behaving in a way that's consistent with a value system, whether or not we follow rules that we feel good about, it causes a reaction in our brain. And you take that all the way back to how our behavior gets shaped by the environment. If I can do something as simple as see that I can take my arm and move the mouse on my keyboard and it causes something to move on my screen, mm-hmm. that causes a reaction in my brain that makes it more likely that I will do that again in the future. I can cause an effect in my environment. Yeah. And being able to do that is a critical experience for human beings and other animals to go through, to teach them how to interact effectively with their environment. Mm-hmm.
And it's why we get addicted to Candy Crush and other stupid games on our phone as well.
And our phones and all of those things. We get tricked and trapped by our biology all the time.
So I sort of we're getting up to our hour mark here, but I would like to get from each of you, because I can see just a lot of parents I know, foster parents I know, adoptive parents I know. Okay, what do I've had a kid that this has happened to them, which I think is the ACE studies. We need to pay attention to what's happening to us. what is, if you could give, if somebody's sitting there to say, oh, I've got a kid with, or I have maybe, 4 or 5 ACEs, what just generally, again, and we'll keep developing this as we develop this topic in the next couple weeks, but I'd love to just get sort of one piece of advice from each of you. If somebody's sitting there, first time they've heard of an ACE study, first time they've heard maybe trauma, can really disrupt brain development in a way that can lead to, things like cancer and addiction and other things. Just let's go around and maybe just give a little bit of a chunk of wisdom to folks that may begin this for the first time and having a little maybe stress reaction of their own. Curt, you want to start us out with that?
Yeah, sure. I think going back to that question of what is it that you want the child to learn, or what is it that you want to arrange the environment to do to support that child, and what do we want to teach people?
Yeah.
And I think that for me, the answer to that question is I want to teach them that people are safe and that they can get help that they need, that they can access external resources when they need them. And I think that those things are the pathway to creating good internal resources.
Great.
So for me, that's what do I want to teach, and how do I arrange the environment to teach people that people are safe? Awesome.
Jerry, let's give me a brief nugget of wisdom from you, my friend.
I don't know about brief. We'll try. But I think what I would recommend is for people to think about when they're interacting with a child, whether it be a foster parent or a teacher, or even if you're interacting with an adult who has a history of trauma, is to begin to say what state is that individual in? And drop the content of what you're talking about and think about is this individual being overwhelmed by some type of stimulation, whether it be hunger, tired, some type of state that they're in, or whether they're in a state of anger or fright that they can't handle it.
Yeah.
And switch to how do I help them manage that state as opposed to the content. So first think about how do I help regulate? Then how do I help relate and connect? And then how do I talk to them about some reasoning? Mm-hmm. So that brain development is very sequential. And when we get stressed, we move down to processing information at lower regions of our brain. So first we regulate, then we relate, then we reason. We can't reason when we're not regulated.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just to add to that is sort of my, again, brief nugget with brief in parentheses is, anytime it's a little thing, but I think it's such a powerful thing, because one of the things we know that trauma does from a psychological perspective is it can steal our sense that we're a worthy person and replace that with shame. And one of the things that a little thing we can all do for kids or adults that have struggled with adverse childhood experiences, complex trauma, big or small T trauma, however we want to label these horrific events at times, is to show them that they are a person of worth. And some of that we do through our language, recognizing accomplishments, celebrating even small achievements. But, as Jerry says always beautifully, is showing them we love them. Showing them that we care about them as a person, whether we're a teacher working with a kindergartner or whether we're a shelter worker working with somebody who's experienced homelessness for the last 20 years. If we can show people that we value them both through our words, but also that we care deeply about them as a people, to me, that's where a lot of healing happens. So we have just scratched the surface, my friends, on this topic, and we'll continue this discussion going into next week. But as always, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. Again, traumainformedlens.org. We'll put show notes. You can find out more about Molly's music therapy, and we'll have some pictures and other fun things up there, slides as well. So again, please visit us, traumainformedlens.org, and we'll see you next week.